Good afternoon, and welcome to our program, The Long Road to the Vote. I'm Pamela Johnson, the president of the WNDC Educational Foundation. It's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the foundation, our wonderful partners, and our outstanding panel of historians. And as you can see, Eleanor Roosevelt, I'm in the Eleanor Roosevelt Library at the WNDC, the Whittemore House. So we have her looking over our shoulders. It is often said that the 19th Amendment gave women the vote. Nothing could be farther from the truth. For more than 70 years, women across the United States, Black and white, Western and Eastern, North and South, organized meetings and conventions, wrote and signed declarations and calls to action, made speeches, wrote articles and books, started magazines, sang and wrote songs. They testified and lobbied in state legislatures and the US Congress, signed petitions with tens of thousands of names. They traveled by foot, horse, buggy, train, and when they became available, cars across town and across country. They founded local, state, and national organizations. They marched, protested, and picketed. And they were heckled, spat on, pushed to the ground, beaten, arrested, and imprisoned, and went on hunger strikes. The vote was hardly given to these brave women. As a result of their labors, 100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment was enacted and became law. The foundation has been examining this history over the past year in a variety of ways. An evening of songs of suffrage a year ago marked the passage of the bill by the Senate, the beginning of the ratification process. We had tea with Sojourner Truth and observed the 18th Amendment enactment with an evening of jazz and bootleg beverages. Then the pandemic hit just as it had 100 years ago, and our program stopped. Today, we are fortunate to get to reflect on this journey with an extraordinary group of historians. Alysha Butler will be our virtual moderator to guide us through our discussion of the history. Ms. Butler teaches history at the McKinley High School in Washington, D.C. to a group of very lucky students. She has a BA and MA in history from Florida Atlantic University, where she specialized in Reconstruction and the rise of feminism in the African-American community. She has been an educator for more than 16 years, and as soon as you meet her, you will understand why she was named National History Teacher of the Year in 2019. We have three outstanding authors and historians on our panel. Dr. Sharon Harley is an associate professor and former chair of the African-American Studies Department at the University of Maryland in College Park, where she researches and teaches Black women's labor history. She contributes to both academic and popular publications. Her article on African-American women in the 19th Amendment was published in the excellent collection by the National Park Service. And she has a new book coming out in the spring, and we're looking forward to it. Kimberly Hamlin is an award-winning historian who specializes in the history of women, gender, and sex in the US. She is a frequent speaker and contributor to the Washington Post and other media. Dr. Hamlin's most recent book is Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner. If you could share our bookstore, her book and the books of our other authors are available in our online Centennial bookstore. Marjorie Spruill is well known for her work on women in politics, from the women's suffrage movement to the present, as well as her history on the American South. Two of her books are in the bookstore, including the second edition of One Woman, One Vote, Discovering the Women's Suffrage Movement. It has just been re-released this month. Dr. Spruill taught at the University of South Carolina and is the former president of the Southern Association of Women Historians. Finally, I would like to turn the program over to Dr. Athelda Bush-Williams, the National Historian of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. I got to know Dr. Bush-Williams when we worked together, along with Suzanne Finney and my EF colleagues, to create the calendar Women in the Vote. Dr. Bush-Williams tutored me on the extraordinary national organizations that African-American suffragists founded, beginning with NACW in 1896. Our second program tomorrow at 1 p.m. will honor three of these organizations with a brand new award, the Mary Church Terrell Century of Service Award. I hope you will join us. Now, Dr. Athelda Bush-Williams.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. I'm delighted to join Dr. Johnson to welcome you to this outstanding event on behalf of the WNDC Educational Foundation and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. It is the first national organization of African American women in the USA, organized in 1896. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the other partners that have joined us in planning and putting on this series of programs on women and the vote. They have all been observing the Centennial in a variety of ways, and despite being incredibly busy, have joined us to make these events a success. They have contributed to the development of the programs, suggesting speakers, promoting them to their members and subscribers, sharing a grant with us to support the program, and serving on the advisory board of the Mary Church Carroll Century of Service Award. They are Dr. Shirley Moody Turner of the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State, Anne Montgomery, Historical Society of Washington, D.C., Diana Bailey, Maryland Women's Heritage Center, Dr. Molly McGregor, National Women's History Alliance, Jennifer Herrera, National Women's History Museum, and Pat Worth, Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. Thank you to you all. As historian for the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, our national president, Andrea Brooks Smith, our members, and our partners, we deem it an honor and a privilege to join today in presenting these outstanding scholars on the women's suffrage movement. Their presentations will inform and enlighten from a perspective that honors the contributions of African American women as well as others. So we look forward with great anticipation to today and to each of the 3 sessions in this seminar series. We offer our sincere thanks for your participation and the contributions of these amazing historians to this event. As we continue to educate ourselves and others, we thank you for helping us to share and embrace the NACWC motto, lifting as we climb. And now let me turn the virtual mic over to Alysha Butler. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to dive right in and get started, and I'm sure you all are as eager as I am. I wanted to first begin by providing a little insight in today's panel format. Each panelist will be asked a series of questions and will be given time to respond. At the end, we will take questions from the chat. So let's go ahead and begin. Our first question is for Dr. Hamlin. In an age where we are witnessing a woman on the cusp of becoming the first Vice President of the United States, it has never been more pertinent to remember the struggle that took place to get here. Can you take a minute to help frame what life was actually like for women in the late 19th and early 20th century before the 19th Amendment in terms of the women's legal limitations and how that impacted every aspect of their life? Specifically, what motivated women to become suffrage activists?
Thank you so much for that great question, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I just want to thank our wonderful hosts and my co-panelists. I'm really honored and excited to mark this Women's Equality Day with you. So to Alysha's question, what was life like for women in the 19th century? Well, I'm going to speak broadly about women as a general category, and then throughout we're going to break it down by different variations of women. But in general, women in the 19th century had no legal rights. Married women were covered, that's that word, coverture, by their husbands. They had no right to the children they bore out of their own bodies. They had no right to own property, even if they inherited it from their own parents. They had no right to their own earnings if they were to make any. Also, while women were allowed to go to what were called common schools then, public schools, and as soon as the common school movement took root, it was very controversial and a hard-won victory for women to be able to go to college. So that's another turning point that we start seeing 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. But for much of the 19th century, women have no rights to property, to money, to have a job, to speak in public. And one of the hardest fought battles of the suffrage movement was convincing other women to join them, right? We often think of the story of suffrage as a story of men, or of women demanding the vote from men, but a huge part of the battle, especially in the 19th century, is getting other women to join on, is getting other women to recognize that there's other ways to live, that separate spheres, the private sphere for women and the public sphere for men, might not be natural. What if it's not preordained by God? What if women could live a full, whole human life? That's the struggle of the 19th century women's rights movement that eventually coalesces into a movement to demand the vote. The other thing I want to highlight real quick, because I've been thinking so much about it in my research for Free Thinker and an essay I published today in Smithsonian Magazine, is the links between bodily autonomy and political autonomy. So for a lot of women who entered reform movements in the late 19th century across races, across classes, across geographies, part of what motivated them was the right to their own bodies. So I'm not talking about birth control necessarily here. I'm talking about things like the right to say no to your husband, the right not to be raped. And the movement I highlighted in particular is the movement led by the temperance activists to raise the age of sexual consent for girls, which in 1890 was 12 or younger in 38 states. Let that sink in for a second, right? So temperance movement, temperance ladies, there were hundreds of thousands of them. They ultimately do demand the vote, but at first they're kind of reluctant. And in part, what helps spur them to demand the vote is what they called home protection and what we might call the right to control what happens to your body. So there's many things we might think of in terms of what motivated women, but those are some of them. Now, I also want to say, and I know that Dr. Spruill is going to talk more about this, but I also want to just say quickly, it's really important for us to remember that the women's rights movement is an outgrowth of the abolition movement. So I know we'll talk more about that, but that's another thing for us to center today in our conversation, the origins of women's rights in abolition.
Thank you. Wow, how insightful. As you know in your latest book, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, in 1919, Gardner feared that if the U.S. did not commemorate women's rights activists, future generations of women would never truly achieve future equality. It's 2020, and we still do not have a National Women's History Museum. What effect do you believe this continued lack of acknowledgement has had on women in their current pursuit of equality?
I think the lack of women's narratives in our larger history, we can't overstate the impact of that, right? So I think we should think about our textbooks, our state standards, our monuments, our museums. What stories do we tell about ourselves as a nation? Even in 2020, women are still sidelined, marginalized. You get a little sidebar, or maybe one name here or there, but the stories, the grand narratives of America is still the triumph of the great white men, right? In 2017, the National Women's History Museum commissioned a report and found basically the same thing that the suffragists found when they commissioned their own report in 1909, because the suffragists too were very concerned about history and women's place in our national narratives. In 1910, the Suffragist Education Committee studied all the history and civics textbooks to see how women were depicted. And at the annual meeting, the committee chair reported, well, history and civics textbooks present the world as if it were made by men and for men. And in 2017, that's essentially what the National American History Museum found in their report. So why does this matter? Well, I think the stories that we tell about our past shape what we think is possible in the present and in the future. And to give just one illustration of this that I often use in my classes, I teach at Miami University in Ohio, and in my women's history class last year, we were really moved by Rebecca Solnit's beautiful essay, City of Women, in which she talks about what does it mean to go through a city, to go through a world in which nothing is named for you or anyone who looks like you, right? And she commissioned a cartographer to reimagine the New York City subway map as if it were named for the women who lived along its stops. So imagine if I say, hey, Marjorie, I'm gonna get on at Serena Williams and I'm gonna get off at Bella Abzug. I'll meet you there, right? What would our world be like if that was the kind of world we inhabited? So I think it's hard really to overestimate the importance of stories in shaping what we think is possible. So I really hope that In addition to sparking an enhanced movement for voter rights and voter access, I really hope that the Suffrage Centennial, which PS is also the 150th of the 15th Amendment, I really hope that this leads us to reframe our stories, to center women's contributions in the stories of America that we tell in our museums, in our monuments, in our textbooks.
Thank you. This next question is for Dr. Spruill. So many of the most recognized leading celebrated women of the women's suffrage movement are from the North. Why did the movement begin in the Northeast? Was there a regional difference in support of the movement? And if so, why?
Yes, the story of the women's suffrage movement is a very different story depending on what region you're talking about. It began in the Northeast. It began to spread into what we now call the Midwest, they call the West. And the first victories then came in the West with Wyoming and Utah and Colorado and Idaho, the only ones where there were victories in the 19th century. And then in the early 20th century, you start having more victories, but again from the West. And the real villain in the story is the American South, which was where the suffrage movement started latest, had encountered phenomenal obstacles and the least success. In the end, there were 10 states that refused to ratify the women's suffrage movement, and 9 of them were south of the Mason-Dixon line. But of course, that begs the question that you asked, why was that? And why did it start in the Northeast? And the answer is that it began as a outgrowth of the anti-slavery movement. There were, I suppose, in general, women were living in more urban environments and more outside the home. And so, we're gaining some experience in organizing and through charitable works and other, but the thing that just was really common among all of the women who emerged as leaders of this women's rights movement and who started this movement were connections with working for the rights of African Americans, through which they then began to discover a need to work for their own rights. Way before the Seneca Falls Convention, which is the 1848 and the date that you could say that a more formal movement began, there were already women who were speaking out on the issues of women's rights. The very first that we have recorded words from was Maria Stewart, who in Boston in the early 30s began to give public lectures that were even given to what they then call promiscuous audiences, which meant that there were both men and women present. Her audiences were also interracial, and for all of those reasons, it would just scandalize a lot of people, and she had a lot of negative feedback, but she was fearless and she just continued to speak to her audience, reprimanding the moderates in the anti-slavery movement for this idea of sending people back to Africa instead of learning to live together in this land, and also calling on free Blacks in the North, including women, to really stand up for their own rights. And then another among the earliest were actually people who left their region and went to another. The Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, who were from a slaveholding family in Charleston, South Carolina, but were disgusted with slavery and went to the North and very soon began to travel as agents of the anti-slavery movement and telling the story of what slavery was like. And they very quickly began to draw large crowds. And as in the case of Maria Stewart, people were hostile to them for women to engage in this. And it's, in a way, it's not so surprising that the hostility was there, given that male anti-slavery speakers also were mobbed and worse. But for women to do this just outraged a lot of people. And so they began to speak even more and to write more about women's rights. And And then, of course, famously, Lucretia Mott, who was one of the founders of the Female Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia, who went to the World Anti-Slavery Conference in London, where she met a young bride, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose husband was a delegate. But there they found that the men who were who were delegates to this were hostile to the idea of women's participation and had voted not to include them. And if they wanted to even be in the room, they had to sit behind, in a balcony and not say a word. And so that was a time where they famously decided that they would, upon returning to the United States, have a women's rights conference. And so, this is why it began in the Northeast.
Thank you. The process of getting an amendment passed is arduous, to say the least. Explain why a localized movement that started in one region of the country grew to a national movement and succeeded in becoming a constitutional amendment.
That is the $64,000 question. That is the what's happened here with this movement is that it eventually turns into a movement to get a constitutional amendment. And the process of getting a constitutional amendment is a very difficult one. And it was deliberately set up that way by our founding fathers. Mm-hmm. They wanted the Constitution to be able to be amended, but they didn't want it to happen lightly, frivolously, or from just with support in just one region of the country. Right. And so, as most of our listeners would know, but it bears reminding, that meant that to be adopted in the Constitution, an amendment had to go to get the support of 2/3 of each House of Congress and 3/4 of the states. And so that meant that a movement that was only in New England, that was perceived by most Americans as radical, was just not going to pass. And so the real story of this, in fact, I used to, before I retired, I would ask my students to answer this question, of how did the movement who started in one part end up having the nationwide support. And basically what ends up happening is that they have to learn to strategize. They had to learn that they could talk till they were blue in the face about the justice of women's suffrage, but they seemed to only have success when they were able to talk the men who had power into thinking that in some way that it benefited them and their party and their interest to support women's suffrage. And so women suffragists learned to do this in lots of different parts of the country, and to sometimes in ways that are truly disgusting, as in the South when white women in the 1890s tried to exploit the race issue by saying that, we know you're in a movement to disfranchise African-American men, to keep them from being able to use their 15th Amendment rights. Don't do that. Congress will punish you. Instead, enfranchise women. There are more white women in the South than there are Black. So that ultimately didn't work. The men who held power were just as hostile to women's rights as they were to the rights of African-American men, or close. And these things were very much linked. And in Colorado, there were alliances with the Free Silver movement and populism. In Utah, the Mormons were among the earliest to enfranchise women because that gave them an advantage in their competition with non-Mormons, who tended to be cowboys and miners and railroad workers who didn't have women with them, and the Mormons did. And so, around the country, this is one of the main things that happened, was to think about how you influence this, because when you get right down to it, this is a movement that had to win without women being able to vote on it for the most part. And so they had to learn how to persuade.
Wow, thank you. This next question is for Dr. Harley. The women's suffrage movement ties to the abolitionist movement is well known. It's been discussed and it's been documented. But even at Seneca Falls, little to no African-American women were present. Is there an event that could be identified as a Seneca Falls for African-American women?
Well, thank you, Alysha, for that great question. Before I begin to respond, I wanted to commend Dr. Bush Williams for her presidency of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Probably 15 or 20 years ago, I helped Charles Wesley write the most recent history of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So I'm honored to be on the panel with her. Now, each of you must have heard of my talk I gave at the Benjamin Banneker Museum in February, because I talked in 1848. Frederick Douglass, as you indicate, well, Frederick Douglass was the only African-American who was there. And so 1848 is a significant year because he leaves there as a courageous Black male feminist, and he goes to the 1848 Colored National Convention, made up of just male delegates, Black male delegates. And Douglass, who always believed that women should have equality and the right to vote, Douglass gets this resolution passed, and I quote, "Whereas we fully believe in the equality of the sexes, therefore that we hereby invite females hereafter to take part in our deliberations."
Wow.
That happened in 1848.
Wow.
And so I'm not sure if people knew this significance about that particular year.
Thank you. Wow, that is
The what's clear is what my colleagues and fellow panelists have indicated is that they were Black women suffragists involved in the abolitionist movement and women's rights movements from the 1820s on. And what I was going to say is a nice segue into the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, because the real thrust comes from NACW in their suffrage department, their presidency of Mary Church Terrell. But there were, in fact, colored women's franchise associations before that. So in 1888, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who was a courageous African-American woman for all kinds of rights, started the Colored Progressive Franchise Association. And so African-American women have been involved in women's suffrage, along with other correspondent activist movements in the 19th century and clearly in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Thank you. What were the issues that drove their fight for suffrage?
Thank you again, Alysha. Great question. And it is a significant question because it wasn't just women's rights. It wasn't just women's suffrage. My friend and Rosalind Turborg Penn, who was a leading scholar of women's suffrage, she was a pioneer scholar of women's suffrage, indicated that, and used this terminology, that Black women suffragists were what she called Black nationalist feminists. That is, in addition to fighting for women's rights, they also fought for the rights of the race. And so always the movement for women's suffrage coming from Black women suffragists was a movement for racial equality, for the Black community. And as I've written both in the National Park Service article and in talks that I've given around the country, it is a broad movement. It isn't just about women's rights. It's about gender equality. It's really about sexual equality. It's about the Black female body. So it's a broad movement. It's about Black electoral politics. And so for many reasons, Black women suffragists, Black women's rights activists don't have the luxury or the privilege to just focus on women's issues as often racial issues, more recently on issues of gender equality and sexual equality. And as my other panelists have indicated, it's been a broad movement among Black women suffragists.
Okay. Looking at the leadership role Black sororities assumed in the fight for Black women's suffrage, was there any identifiable differences in their strategies and the strategies of white activists? Can you also highlight the major leadership role of the NACW and Black church women?
Okay, thank you. Well, as I said earlier, the NACW played a major role. They had, well, of course, Mary Church Terrell is its first president, so she was the leading women's suffragist, both in the United States and internationally. She represented the United States at international women's rights meetings and conventions, and so the NACWC is just plays such a critical role.
Okay.
When it had its meetings, as the history indicates, they would end their biennial meetings by visiting the Frederick Douglass home in Cedar Hill in Washington Southeast. And I've written about their critical role in the preservation of that home. Initially, it had been given to a couple of male leaders to preserve the home, but it was the NACWC that closed that mortgage, that did the major fundraising that was involved. According to the work of my colleagues Betty Collier Thomas and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Black church women were active as suffragists. I mean, Nanny Helen Barrows is the person who comes to mind, who was active as a feminist, and the Nanny Helen Barrows, who was active as a feminist, and the Women's Auxiliary helped to form it of the National Baptist Convention. And she was a leading suffragist. And I'm glad you asked this question about church women, because we sometimes mistakenly believe that church women were not politically active. And in Jesus, Jobs, and Justice by Dr. Betty Collier Thomas, she clearly indicates the activism that Black church women had played in the organization. Now, when it comes to sororities, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority and the Delta Sigma Theta and others, they were college women, and so oftentimes their interests overlap with white college women. So I think it's important to note that they were not always these vast distinctions between what they wanted.
Okay.
So we know, for instance, that Nellie Kwanda, who was the president of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, wrote to Alice Paul asking, could Black college women be active from Howard and other places, participate in the women's suffrage parade of 1913. Her question and request was that they not be racially segregated. And that didn't happen, but the Delta Sigma Theta sorority came with a large banner and participated in that women's suffrage parade of 1913. And of course, we know Ada B. Wells courageously was a part of the Chicago delegation, and she was supposed to be segregated. The colored women were going to be in the back. But those of you who know this history, you should know that Ada B. Wells did not take no for an answer, whether it came from leading Black male elites, whether it came from powerful corporations, or whether it came from her fellow white women suffragists. So when told that she could participate, would be at the back of the parade, she waited till the parade went by and she jumped into the Chicago delegation, and people describe her as having a smirk on her face because she was not going to be willingly participated in the segregated movements.
Thank you. This next question is for Dr. Hamlin. In an era where many historians and educators are re-examining how the narrative of this country is told, what is your position on whether more effort should be shifted to exploring biographies of dynamic women like Gardner, or the movement as a whole?
That's a great question, and one that we historians debate a lot among ourselves, I would say. What is the role of biography in history? I'm a proponent of the role of biography in history, in part because I think it's a great learning tool for students, right? I think connecting movements to actual people who had actual lives, who were flawed and interesting and brilliant and courageous all at the same time, makes social change, historical change, seem more possible, right? We are not all perfect, and it helps to learn about people who advocated for change and how they did it. So I also think it's a both and, basically. And I'd be interested to hear, Alysha, from you as the, national winning history teacher, what you think as an educator what the role of biography is. But from my perspective, I'd like for it to be a both and, to learn about social movements And I know there is a sort of a tricky calculation in biography, right? Like whose names? Okay, if we're gonna learn names, whose names? So that's kind of oversimplify, but I do think it's important to know names and know stories and to expand the repertoire of the names that we do know.
Yes, definitely. I completely agree with you, Dr. Hamlin. I feel, you know, being a 20-year public school teacher veteran, that my goal has always been to bring in the unknown voices in history.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can't really tell their story without telling the stories of the known people in history, like where those major biographies are kind of centered. I have an additional question for you. And this is very important for my students. So many of the images that dominate literature and teaching resources about the leaders of the movement depict them as elderly and reserved women. That sometimes makes it hard for subsequent generations of women to identify and truly appreciate their tenacity and how revolutionary they really, really were. What would you replace those images with? And what would you like current generations, like my students, to know about the leaders of this phenomenal movement?
Also a great question. Thank you so much, Alysha. I couldn't agree more. I feel like suffragists and also temperance advocates and some their cousins get this really bad rap, right? Like they're boring, it's nagging. Oh, and the word suffrage somehow makes it seem like we're gonna have to learn about them. And I think it's time really that we reimagine this. And in part, it's the images, like you say, but it's also how we view the images, right? Why do we view images of older women in dresses and think, oh, that also has to do with how we approach ideas about power and stories, right? We should celebrate these women. We should also, I think, again, add to our repertoire of images to incorporate more women of color, more younger women, more suffragists when they were younger. Many of them, like the woman I just wrote about, entered reform movement as young women in their 20s, right? Let's also highlight that. That would make it, I think, more meaningful to our students to realize how young Elizabeth Cady Stanton was in 1848, to realize how young Helen Hamilton Gardner was when her name was asked in newspapers as a fallen woman, right? Those are stories we can relate to. So I really agree so much with what you're saying. And I think it's so important that we reframe these stories of suffrage and also of temperance to make them more central, and to point out, I'm kind of paraphrasing my friend Kate LeMay, who was quoted in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, as saying, you know, these aren't nagging older women. These women are political geniuses, right? That's how we should be talking about them and thinking about them.
One of the movies I used to actually play for my students years ago, it's an old HBO made-for-TV movie called Iron Dog Angels. Yeah, my students love that
history
movie.
Advisor.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, my students love the movie because they portrayed them as younger women, not much older than my students, and they really were able to identify with them. Thank you for that insight. This next question is for Dr. Spruill. In modern day efforts to provide a more detailed and accurate narrative of the women's suffrage movement, what are the key understandings that must be included when exploring the movement in the South and their contributions to the 19th Amendment?
Well, I think it's true that there's been less attention to the South. I mean, there have been a lot of us that have written about it. A lot of us are Southern women who are trying to grapple with what's going on in our region. That always seems to come out lowest on the good indicators of women's status and highest on the bad ones. So it's always a struggle to sort of understand our region and the role of women in it. And like a lot of other ways in which the South is different from the rest of the country, a lot of it comes down to race, that you cannot understand these differences without that, and particularly when you're looking at politics. And so basically the answer to that is that one of the things that's important to understand in politics is your opposition. And it's also important to understand how you can win in an inhospitable climate. And therefore, I would say that since the suffragists lost in most of the southern states, maybe you should look at the four, Texas, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, where they did succeed. And that final battle that took place in Tennessee is one for the ages, where the opponents came from all over the country to join those who were there, and proponents came from all over. And there's never been so much politicking and persuasion, both front door lobbying and back door lobbying. And I would say that in the case of these border states, it was a bit different from the Deep South states, where the Democratic Party had just a solid hold, and the race issue was pretty much blocking the women's suffrage progress. But in Tennessee, particularly, the suffragists could draw on the fact that it was a two-party state, and that there were some African-American men that were still voting. And they worked with women like Frankie Pierce, an African-American woman who was involved in working with white women in getting the support they needed for the ratification, and whose statue is there on the statue in Nashville as part of the people responsible for that victory.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on, I do know that Dr. Hamlin actually has to gracefully exit. I just wanted to thank her for participating in the panel. And I am very much looking forward to reading more on her recent book. The next question is for Dr. Harley. What were the arguments used by Black suffrage activists prior to the signing of the 19th Amendment? I know that, you know, the NAWSA relied on the appeal of religious duty and temperance. But what were the main arguments of Black suffrage activists?
I'm assuming you mean arguments for women.
The right to vote.
Okay. Great. Well, I mean, all along, equality has been a major philosophical, ideological position for people of color and for most women. So all along, African-American women believed that they should have the right to vote. They should have full equality. And part of that argument was that we would never be totally free unless we had that equality. Part of the argument also included the fact that if we didn't have the right to vote, it would impact so many other things: employment, housing, all aspects of life. So it wasn't just electoral politics. It was a broader narrative. It was a button up that would protect African-American women from sexual assault, from physical assault. So they thought it was critical to their very existence and their very life. So they argued for the right to vote. Now they smartly would say, especially if there was any opposition in their own communities, that Black women were morally superior. Sometimes they really exaggerated that, but they made the moral superiority argument in order to argue that if they had the right to vote, there'd be no shenanigans, there would be no fraud or anything like that, because they would take the higher moral ground. So they use a variety of arguments about why women should have the right to vote, but critical to that was not only to promote African-American women's causes and their freedom, but the larger freedom of Black communities. And someone like Anna Julia Cooper would say that it was also, she was a humanitarian. It was everybody would benefit, not just women of color, not just African-American women, but the human race would benefit if people had the right to vote and if they had the franchise. And these are arguments that we're hearing as we speak about the importance of the right to vote and its significance.
I wanted to ask you, we know that many of the founders and many of the leaders in the current Black Lives Matter movement are women. And this was a very small movement that just grew, we can't even say nationally, but globally. Yes. I'm really curious, do you see any through lines, any connections with the strategies that these, very phenomenal women have used in the Black Lives Matter and trying to get support? Do you see any connections with their strategies or in any of their arguments to those women back in the 19th century trying to get people to support, women's suffrage?
Well, Alysha, you were alluding to a little bit my forthcoming book.
Oh.
Which I don't speak specifically about Black Lives Matter except for the epilogue. But what I'm arguing is that Black women have played central roles in various political movements and activist movements, but they have not always gotten the credit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was Rosa Parks, for instance, and that group that invited Martin Luther King to come as we're going to celebrate the anniversary of March on Washington. It were Black women who played central roles. Oscar Dupree says in 1928 that he won his first congressional election in 1928, the first since Reconstruction, because of Black women, because of Black women's activism. We know South Carolina, the Black women's roles. I think what's different and what's powerful about Black Lives Matter is that they're not waiting for a leader, and that leader, unfortunately, often is male. They're not waiting for any official mandate. It is a progressive activist movement that is from the grassroots. And I would argue that it is so progressive and powerful because it has women, not that men are not involved with the movement, but that women have taken the leadership role and they're not waiting for affirmation. And so my forthcoming book, I talk about, and what other panelists have indicated, the important role of Black women in various activist movements in the post-emancipation period up to 1920. But that often has been hidden from the narrative. It is, and I have this in my book as well, that it's the James Brown narrative, it's a man's world. But I think that what the Black Lives Matter is clearly a Black women's world. We just have to get the music to match what we know is a part of contemporary narrative. So women were there, unfortunately, often in the background and often portrayed as playing secondary roles. But when we investigate it, we know that their roles, their ideology was powerful and significant in the success of numerous Black political movements across the United States and globally.
I cannot wait to bring that into my classroom in the fall in a couple of weeks. I love that line, not waiting for a leader or a mandate. So almost like not waiting necessarily for a Dr. King, just assuming the ropes themselves. I really, really like that. It's very powerful. Dr. Spruill, this next question is for you. How much of Southern women's feelings towards women's suffrage and women's equality from the time the 19th Amendment passed drove the conflicting factions that emerged within the women's rights movement of 1977 and continue to linger today in Southern women's feelings towards feminism and the Me Too movement?
You know, I'm not sure which of the divisions among Southern women or among women that you're talking about, whether you're talking about Black-white relations among rights advocates in the 70s, or are you talking about conflicts between conservatives,
and, yes,
okay.
Conservatives and liberals. Mm-hmm.
Well, the conservative movement that rose up to oppose the feminist movement in the 1970s was not an exclusively Southern movement, despite the fact that once again, the majority of states that did not ratify the Equal Rights Amendment were Southern states. And as we know, the leadership for the anti-ERA movement, and which then turned into a more permanent anti-feminist movement that they called the pro-family movement, much to the objections of feminists who believe that our movement is the pro-family movement, in fact. Yeah. But Phyllis Schlafly, of course, was the person who stepped up in 1972 and seemingly out of nowhere, but she had a network of conservative women all over the country who were politically experienced. And some of them, the ones who were in the Deep South, some of them were women who were experienced politically as a part of massive resistance to integration, to the civil rights movement. And but the conservative movement again was nationwide, and it became a coalition of that was fueled by religious conservatism, by groups that are particularly attached to the idea of male leadership in church, society, and the family. And a lot of the foot soldiers for, if you will, for Schlafly's movement, the ones who then joined forces with her, partly at the leadership of a woman called Lottie Beth Hobbs from Texas, who was a leader among women in the Church of Christ. That was really what fueled it. And that part was especially strong in the South.
Okay, thank you. I would like the next two questions to be open to both panelists. The first question is, which strategy or strategies do you think were the most impactful in getting the amendment passed? And what do you think, what lessons does the history of the women's suffrage movement provide for voting rights activists today?
Like me to take a shot? Well, let's just say one thing that I didn't mention before is that I think that the coming of the progressive movement in American history, a movement that starts in the 1890s and really swells in the early 2 decades of the in which people had a new vision of what they wanted government to do, that they wanted it, instead of being laissez-faire, to be more positive, activist, reliance on experts, and do more to protect the people, protect workers from the excesses of industrialization and corporate exploitation. And they wanted to protect children from being forced into child labor and not be able to have schooling. They wanted to protect women workers from disasters like the Triangle Fire. And even some of these Southern women that I'm talking about, who were very conservative when it came to Black voting rights, some of them were more supportive when it came to more for public health measures for the whole community. And even some of them were anti-lynching. They were not monolithic at all, but they also played, some of them, a role in getting rid of convict labor in some places within the South. So the progressive movement, what I'm trying to say here is that a lot of women became interested in getting the vote, and as a way of supporting all these reforms, including to clean up government. And so people's ideas about women's nature and the idea that they were more compassionate and moral, and also that they were especially concerned with the welfare of children and with public education, public health. All of the idea that women would support progressive reform was one of the key reasons why women's suffrage eventually succeeded.
Okay.
I would just add, when you speak of the South, that in particular, as Jacqueline Rouse has written a lot about Southern Black women, and as Professor Spruill mentioned, oftentimes not just Southern white women are excluded from the dominant narratives, but often Southern Black women. And so we know that where the majority of Black women lived in the South, they were active in the women's suffrage movements and various reform movements. And so they situated it in that the whole community would benefit, that it would have benefit to progressive causes, to reform causes. But as Rosalind Torborg Penn wrote in our first co-edited volume, The African-American Women, Struggles and Images, it was in fact Black or colored men at that time who supported largely the women's suffrage movement. And because African-American women had largely positioned it as one that would benefit the community and the race as well as women. Of course, there were some men who were not in favor of it. And then there were some women who were very, very progressive, like Ida B. Wells and the like. And so I think basically the argument for women's suffrage was the arguments African-American women in particular had made for racial equality, because they opposed both racial and gender inequality.
I actually
And I would like to mention someone whose name hasn't come up yet, and that's Adela Hunt Logan, who was, of course, a very active member of the NACW and a lifelong member of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And she was one of the African-American women who worked very hard and openly for women's suffrage while still living in the South, where it was extraordinarily risky to do. And speaking about Black men, it was also kind of amazing that she had the audacity to do this while living next door to Booker T. Washington, even during the time that he wasn't so keen on it. And I don't think he ever really was, but he eventually realized he needed to support it. But she was writing for his arch rival, W.B. Du Bois's The Crisis, even while they are in Tuskegee. And of course, her arguments overlap a lot with these I'm talking about in terms of progressive reform, and with what Sharon is talking about in terms of the vote for the whole Black community and for human rights in general. But she was often saying, if white women need the vote in order to protect their families, then women of color need it even more. She was really something. That was quite an amazing woman.
Yeah, I had the awesome opportunity to meet her granddaughter, who just
Adele.
She was actually at the celebration for the National History Teacher of the Year, and she gifted me her book, and her book was just amazing, opened my eyes. Last question.
Has a new book. Adele Alexander has a new book, Prince of Isles. These are award-winning books, and there are several articles in a special issue of the New York Times on the right to vote, and she's a part of that conversation. So Adele Alexander's new book is called The Princes of the Hither Isles, a Black suffragist story from the Jim Crow South. And so it's a highly
absolutely gripping
page
turner.
Very good. I enjoyed that thoroughly. The last question that I have for you all is, what has been left unfinished in the movement in 2020?
A lot. A lot. This is a really exciting time right now when it comes to women's suffrage and to African-American women's leadership in politics. This is an election of our lifetime, where so much is at stake. And I think one of the really hopeful things about it is that African-American women have become leaders in the direction of our country, that so-called gender gap that has politicians in fear. That's a gender gap. It's there. It favors the Democrats and more progressive candidates because of African-American women. And, that African-American women were denied that right to denied the opportunity to use the right that they gained from the 19th Amendment until that success of the voting rights movement in the 60s, in which they played such a leading role. But after that, they have become the most, the best in terms of turnout and passionate about supporting progressive candidates of any voters in any demographic. That role has just been rewarded now and recognized through the selection of Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee. Also in the 2018 elections, we had a surge in the numbers of women who ran for office all over the country, including large numbers of women of color, and many of them won. And we have the most diverse Congress that we've ever had. And so in my mind, it's a very hopeful time. And the very fact that it's such a hopeful time in terms of turnout is one of the main reasons, of course, why some people are doing so much to suppress the votes. And so it's we're living in a time in which it's more important than ever to think about suffrage and politics and the need to gain that vote, protect that vote, and use that vote.
Like that.
I would just add that it forces us to acknowledge this long history of activism on the part of Black women and women in general. It's not a new phenomenon. It's just getting more and more coverage. And what women are getting, particularly African-American women, women of color, Native American women, Latinx women, that they have been a part of a progressive movement. It's just getting more attention. And so for some people, it seems like it's totally new, but they have been activists all along. And my book is about how they negotiate that activism in what was still a man's world. How do we negotiate our activism? How do we have to position it? Historically, if we live in a predominantly male space, and we're hoping that we're moving from this predominantly male space to a progressive humanist space that includes people of diverse races and genders and sexualities. And so it's promising, but we have to make sure that we keep our eye on the prize. And so as we think about John Lewis, I often ask people to think about somebody who was equally progressive, Gloria Richardson from Cambridge, Maryland. I've written about her. And there's a picture of John Lewis and Gloria Richardson from the Cambridge Civil Rights Movement. She was very, very progressive. I tend to write about those kind of women in general. But but we want to be able to acknowledge that these women were significant, they were there, and oftentimes they influenced the conversation that a king had, and they were even more progressive, for instance, Gloria Richardson, than King at the moment. And there are people who were in other places who were very progressive, and they influenced some of the male leaders in terms of their ideological positions.
I made sure in my Southern class, I'm not using that Southern class, I had a summer class this year on on Selma and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and I made sure my students knew Gloria Richardson in and out. So it's like comforting to hear that. I hope I'm on the right track here. So my part with my questions are coming to an end, and now I'd really like to open up the panel to questions from the chat. So I am going to switch over to the chat so I can see some of the questions that were submitted before we close. And let me go ahead and just scroll. This question is for, let's see. Hold on. What was the Black male group that endorsed suffrage in 1848? This was from Christine. This is to all the panelists, not necessarily for anyone. And she also asked, what was the Black Women's Franchise Group in 1898? And she also asked, what was the name of the history film depicting suffragists as young and energetic? I can answer that. That was Iron-Jawed Angels with Hilary Swank. So I don't know if any of the panelists would like to answer the first question she asked. What was the Black male group that endorsed suffrage in 1848?
It was the colored convention movement. And so what they were endorsing was that women should have a right to participate in that deliberation. My colleague Elsa Barkley Brown has written about how even though these were male political spaces, African-American women attended, and they often spoke out or they made their positions known. They were not official delegates, but they often tried to influence these organizations like the Colored Convention. And remind me, your second part of your question, or the question was?
The other question that they had asked was, this question was, okay, here we go. What was the Black Women's Franchise Group in 1898?
I don't know the one in 1898. I know in 1880, one of the first franchise organizations was founded by Mary Ann Sharon Carey, and it was the Colored Franchise Association, and that was in 1880. But when the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs formed in 1896, immediately it took up the suffrage cause because its president was a leading suffragist, Mary Church Terrell, and always had been active, had a suffrage department, Ada B. Wells and other suffragists. So it played a leading role, but there were also the Ada B. Wells suffrage clubs. They were both local, regional, and national organizations, but the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was the leading national body for women's suffrage and women's rights.
Thank you. The next question is from Sabrina, and this is for all the panelists. As we continue to see solidarity between Black and Brown communities and movements like Black Lives Matter, is there evidence of support from non-Black people of color within the suffrage movement and or the NACW?
So,
I don't understand the question.
yeah, because what's the
Sorry.
Black people of color?
Okay. Yeah, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most, maybe just learning about other members of other communities that might have also supported the suffrage movement, meaning that the Black Lives Matter Now movement has grown to incorporate so many different communities, right? So I guess their question is, do we see that, is there any evidence of that same diversity within the suffrage movement and also in the NACW membership?
Well, go on, Marcia.
Oh, I was just going to say that one of the reasons for the success of the suffrage movement was its diversity, and that as it moved from the Northeast and spread throughout the country, it gained that geographical diversity, but it also it appealed to people of all kinds of people. And for instance, someone mentioned the WCTU earlier. When that movement, which is one of really of conservative Christian women who go, it changes the dynamics of the movement a lot, because it has women who might ordinarily think that suffrage was too radical for them or whatever, who now see it as their duty, their religious duty to get involved. And also it was the largest women's voluntary organization in the country, and perhaps the world at that time. And it had chapters in all parts of the country. So it brought a lot in. And when people in different immigrant communities and around the country were interested in women's suffrage. It also had broadened in terms of class. And in New York, there was organizations such as the Women's Trade Union League, which was a cross-class organization that emphasized that working women needed protection. All over the country, it was there was more and more people interested in. In fact, after women got the right in 1920, and all these people who had expected this massive movement of millions of people to all vote the same, and then were shocked when no woman's bloc appeared, they failed to recognize this great diversity of this movement, and that women who were different from one another in just about every way, but agreed with the idea that women ought to have the right to vote, then differed greatly in how they used it once they got it.
It's also true that Native American women were occasionally invited to speak at women's suffrage meetings. Often the conversation was, there was some fascination with Native American women suffragists and their focus on matriarchal power and women's power and the like. And so when Native Americans became involved in the movement, then they took up other issues, not just electoral politics, but politics about assimilation, about land ownership and the like. So it's not just, and I'm glad you asked that question, or you're somebody in the audience, it's not just a movement of Black or white suffragists. It was a movement that included Native American women as well.
And it should be noted that 4 years after 1924, there was an Indian Citizenship Act that that basically allowed more Native Americans to vote. The 19th Amendment as well as the 15th applied only to citizens. And so any woman who was living in the country who was not a citizen or not allowed to become a citizen, which shockingly was the case of Asian women, they couldn't gain the vote, even though quite a few of them actually participated in the suffrage movement. And so there were some very interesting Native American women living in Washington in the 1910s who affiliated with the suffragists and marched in that parade that we're speaking about, like Marie Baldwin, who became one of America's first women of color to become a lawyer. And they actively worked in the early 20s to gain voting rights for Native Americans.
Thank you. I know I came across an article a couple days ago. This CNN had an article about Asian women and their contributions to the suffragist movement, and I can't wait to use that into my classroom because I never even thought of incorporating that as well. It's so funny. You could be a teacher for all these years, 20 years, and still learning to continuously just expand, the narrative. So thank you for that. Those are excellent suggestions. I do have one question here, and it's for all the panelists. How can we use the lessons from the past to galvanize current voters?
I think making people mad is always a really effective way to get people to vote, to remind people of what's at stake, and to remind people of examples of voter suppression and denial of the vote. So if you look at the combination of what not having voted costs us, and the fear that we're going to vote, I think that reminding people of all of that is a great way to mobilize.
Yeah.
And it's, the early activists, it was at a great sacrifice. I mean, it was, people were lynched for exercising the right to vote. People were lynched for just joining the NAACP. So I often say, as people say, you stand on other people's shoulders, their whole body, their life was at stake, and they did this a great sacrifice. And so we owe it to them and to ourselves to be involved in not only registering to vote, but being involved in that vote, because people made enormous sacrifices. For us, it may be voting early or finding a ballot box a mailbox, but we can do it. And this is a small sacrifice considering what people have done to give us that right to vote. I mean, I can just name a whole list of people whose lives were lost because of their activism and pushing for the right to vote.
I totally agree. I know for my small part in it, I have a shirt that it says "Vote like your ancestors died for it," and I plan on wearing that every single Friday for my students until Election Day.
We also know that Hispanic and Latinx women were involved in the suffrage movement. Some of them were very prominent women in New Mexico and places like that. So I think there are very few people who were outside of the women's suffrage movement. And what's interesting, I think maybe Professor Spruill may mention this or somebody else, that this doesn't end in 1920. That these women, particularly African-American women, now are facing disfranchisement. So there is a grandmother clause comparable to the grandfather clause to keep African-American women from voting.
Wow.
So this progressive struggle for the right to vote also gets articulated in electoral politics, political campaigns, we're just happy that we're seeing more women active in the women's electoral politics, running for office and winning that electoral office.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that I saw from the chat. I think at this point, before we have our closing remarks, I believe that Dr. Bush-Williams, if you're still out there, wanted to say a few things.
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. I want to take this opportunity to thank our fabulous historians today, Dr. Spruill and Harley and Hamlin. I can hardly wait to get my hands on your great works. They've been very enlightening today, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to be with us. And I also want to thank you, Alysha Butler, because you have done a great job in moderating today and providing those great questions. They really help to deepen our understanding. And congratulations also in your being designated as the Social Studies Teacher of the Year. Congratulations again. But I also want to take this time to give a special thank you to Dr. Pamela Johnson, who is the president of the WNDC Educational Foundation, because of your vision and your inspiration in coordinating this entire series. Without your work, we would not have this event today. So thank you, Dr. Pamela Johnson, for all you've done. And thank you for this time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bush-Williams, and thank all the panelists and Alysha Butler. This has really been a wonderful day. What a great conversation to have on the 100th anniversary. Really bringing back all of these extraordinary women who worked so hard. We have 2 more events tomorrow to continue our honoring of the Centennial. Tomorrow is picking up on an awful lot of things that were said about the organizations. And what's quite extraordinary, I think it's one of the real gifts of the suffragists, that not only did they work, but they formed these organizations that survived and were created and have survived for 100 years. So we are honoring 3 of those organizations tomorrow. And we will find out what they did between 1920 and 2020. So that's at 1 o'clock tomorrow. And then at 6, we're taking one of the questions is, well, how do you motivate people to vote? And we're really looking at the tools and tactics to energize the youth. And we know that they're still voting. Their voter participation has increased, but it's still the lowest demographic group in terms of voter participation. And fortunately, we have fabulous teachers like Alysha Butler who are inspiring their classes. How do we extend those lessons and galvanize people and really bring the recognition that this has been a gift, a precious gift from our forefathers. I would just like to reference, if you can show the website again, there are several tools there that I think may be of interest to this group. We've created educators' resources, and on the right-hand side that has the bookstore we looked at earlier. And I hope, Dr. Spruill, your book is up now, but if not, it'll be up tomorrow. It also has information on tools and tactics for voting. You can register to vote, and it also has a new timeline. Can you show the next slide with the a timeline that looks at an interactive timeline for the whole scope of history that we're talking about here. This is still evolving, and we welcome your comments and suggestions from the historians on the panel and in the audience, so we can really make this a useful tool. It's an extraordinary expanse of history. So let me just finish by thanking again the panel, by you, Ms. Butler, by the fantastic staff who's been doing all of this technology. We've actually shifted from in-person programming to virtual programming with this event today. And we are all looking forward to welcoming you at the Whittemore House when we can do that. But thank you for being with us today. And thank all of our partners and everyone who's contributed to this event. Hope to see you tomorrow.